Good morning, everyone. My name is Fred Wagner. I'm in the Environmental and Infrastructure Practice Group here at Venable, and I want to thank you all for joining us here for our latest in our webinar series on analyzing how the election outcome is going to be affecting federal policy in a variety of sectors. And today our discussion is going to be focused on the transportation sector under a Biden administration. I'm joined by two of my partners, Jim Burnley in the Legislative and Transportation Group. Jim, former Secretary of Transportation, former General Counsel at the Department of Transportation, and a variety of other leadership positions there, and has been practicing in this area for almost 40 years. My other colleague, Ariel Wolf, is also in our legislative group. Ariel has been in Venable, and then he went into the Trump administration working in the Secretary's office with Elaine Chao, focusing on a whole variety of transportation issues, specifically, though, in the innovation and automated vehicle sector at DOT. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Jim and Ariel. For your information, a recording of this session will be available shortly on our firm website, and you could also look for other webinars on our election series that will be recorded there, and two more webinars, one on trade and one on labor and employment, the remainder of this week. So please join us and look at venable.com to learn more about those webinars and how to contact any of our professionals if you have questions about the transition and other regulations. I'm going to turn it over now to Jim Burnley, who is going to do a quick introduction about how we got here and where we are, and then we'll dive into the content of the webinar. Just a couple of notes. Please don't hesitate to use the question and answer tab at the bottom of the page. Whenever you have any questions, we'll be entertaining them at the end of our presentations, but we'll be monitoring them during the presentation, so please don't hesitate to use that tab. And then finally, we will be providing a continuing legal education code for you during the webinar, so you'll be able to enter that code and get credit for this hour. So I will not forget to do that, and with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Burnley.
Thank you, Fred, and you've been unduly modest. Fred was the Chief Counsel of the Federal Highway Administration for 4 years during the Obama administration, and has been immersed since that time in a variety of environmental and transportation issues as a partner in our environmental practice. I'm going to run very quickly through the first several slides because I think everyone is already very familiar with most of this data, but you'll see the map as it now stands. All 50 states have declared a winner in the presidential race, and the Electoral College vote is expected to be 306, which has been the case since a couple of days after the election for President-elect Biden. In the Senate, as I think almost everyone knows, ultimately control of the Senate comes down to the outcome January 5th in the runoffs in the two Georgia Senate races. And they're getting, as I think you would also know, around-the-clock coverage, and unprecedented amounts of money are being spent by both sides. So in terms of knowing a fundamentally important point about how we will be governed, and particularly on transportation-related issues in the next 4 years, the outcomes of those two races are all important. As the next slide suggests, we've still got, in the lame duck, a lot of issues outstanding. I'm sure most of you are following the issues of particular interest to you quite closely. And as to how that comes out in terms of an omnibus or a continuing resolution, whether there is further substantial relief related to the COVID crisis, we will all know the answer to those questions in the next few days. This is just a reminder of who's where in the senior leadership relevant to transportation, broadly speaking, and no need to go through these slide by slide. Rose DeLauro was chosen by the House Democratic Caucus, I believe Monday of this week, to chair the House Appropriations Committee. She still has to be approved by the full House after the new Congress comes into session. But there may be those who expect a continuing fight there, but I think the odds are pretty good that she will chair the House Appropriations Committee. And I should note also, before I turn it back to Fred, we don't have a slide about the House of Representatives, but on Real Clear Politics as of today, Republicans have picked up a net of 11 seats and have 212 seats. And as you all know, it takes 218 to have a majority, so they're only 6 seats out of the majority. That is relevant to today's conversation because of the fact that will influence the ratio of members, Republican versus Democratic, on the various House committees. And the two parties' leadership will have to work that out in the next few weeks. But it probably means with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee that the margin will be relatively close between Democrats and Republicans on that committee, and similarly on the other committees. And with that, Fred, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks so much. This is the topics that we're going to cover broadly for the remainder of our hour. Before we dive into the particulars, I think there's a little bit of a reality check that we'd like to offer to all the attendees. And that's just a review of a little bit of past history. January 20th is obviously the turnover of authority and the inauguration, but it's not necessarily the day when all decision makers are in place at the U.S. Department of Transportation and or other agencies in the federal government that will have a large influence on transportation policy. Indeed, there is a fair amount of lag time between the inauguration and when key political decision makers, presidential appointees, are in place at the departments. And for a little bit of past history to give you a sense of what that means in reality, Jim had the opportunity to look at some of the approval dates, the appointment dates for some of the key decision makers at DOT in 2009 during the last transition to a Democratic administration. And Jim, you may want to share some of those.
Yes, it's important, I think, to emphasize that what does not happen on January 20 is that the new administration does not get full effective control of the executive branch. It takes quite a while to get senior positions filled, particularly those positions that require Senate confirmation, and there are about a dozen of those at the Department of Transportation. Jeff Davis over at the Eno Center for Transportation did an article a few days ago that pulled the data together on the Obama administration's experience as to DOT in 2009. It's very striking. Ray LaHood was confirmed as secretary 2 days after the inauguration, but his deputy secretary, John Picari, was not confirmed until May 21st. Other senior positions, some of the assistant secretaries, like, for example, budget, that was not confirmed until August 7th. The highway administrator was not confirmed until July 10th. And strikingly, the NHTSA administrator was confirmed on Christmas Eve, December 24th. And the maritime administrator, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administrator was also not confirmed until early November. So it is a slow and rolling process, and while the non-Senate confirmation positions can be filled much more quickly, it just takes a while for a new administration to really get control of the processes and then to begin to carry out the initiatives of the new administration.
Excellent. All right. Well, the main areas that we'll be covering for discussion deal with legislation and regulation, technology and innovation, civil rights, equity and related issues, and then an overview of priorities in the various modal administrations inside the U.S. DOT. That's a lot of ground to cover, but we think we'll be able to do so for the remainder of the hour. So again, I'll ask Jim to kick off the discussion on legislation and regulation. So Jim, why don't you start there?
Okay, I'll be happy to, Fred. The Biden campaign documents included, as most of you are probably familiar with, a document called the Build Back Better plan, which is his vision of how to go forward in a Biden administration on infrastructure issues. And as described in the campaign materials, it would be a $2 trillion package to be spent over 4 years. Infrastructure, by the way, is defined more broadly than just transportation infrastructure. It includes schools, water, energy, and even broadband. It also has, and I think it's safe to say we will see this as a very major area of emphasis in the new administration, a good deal of language about environmental initiatives styled as clean transportation initiatives. So the question then will be how quickly Congress is able to respond. And again, it's never as fast as you might expect. Typically, in a new Senate, it takes until March for the committees to be fully up and running. The House may get off to a faster start. And of course, the House passed an infrastructure bill last year that can be a starting point. There's a lot of overlap between that bill and the Biden campaign materials. But I think that the first major legislative initiative that those of us in the transportation world will be focused on will probably be that infrastructure package, although perhaps I'm wrong about that, because it's conceivable if the lame duck does not do a substantial COVID-related relief package, that the new Congress will be under great pressure to move very, very quickly on that front. And such legislation could easily include, and probably will include, if it's comprehensive, a lot of transportation-related aid for transit, for airports, for the airlines, for the concessionaires at airports. So we may have on parallel tracks the infrastructure package on the one hand and a big COVID relief package on the other. On the regulatory front, I think what we'll probably see straight out of the box is an effort to be more aggressive in having federal regulations govern aspects of travel, particularly on commercial aircraft. The Trump administration was not willing to put out, for example, a mask mandate, although all the airlines have put out their own company mandates. But I think there will be a quick move, most likely, to stiffen regulations that relate to travel and the virus. Then, again, we're going to see, and it'll be a more gradual process by and large, I think a major effort set of initiatives to reverse some of the things that the Trump administration has done on the environmental front, particularly the package they finished just very recently on environmental review processes. And Fred, you might want to take a couple minutes and reflect upon what you expect, since that's your area of particular expertise.
I will. But before we get there, Jim, back to the reauthorization and the legislation scenario. You know, the packages that were passed in the House and some of the proposals in the Senate actually did, if you read them carefully, they actually did include a fair amount of electric vehicle infrastructure provisions and what could be called, you know, pieces, not the totality, but pieces of the Green New Deal type priorities. How much of a flashpoint do you think that's going to remain in consideration of an overall reauthorization package?
I think there's going to be a very spirited debate around those issues, and the Senate, regardless of the Georgia races' outcomes will be evenly balanced. So they're going to have to work towards a consensus to move any large package on reauthorization of surface transportation in the Senate. And even in the House, as I said before, with the Democratic majority much smaller than it was in the last Congress, and with some moderate Democrats perhaps looking at what happened this fall and worrying about 2022, it may be the case that even what we saw the House pass last year will be debated further in terms particularly of the environmental related provisions. But there's no question in my mind that these are going to be front and center issues across all the modes of transportation next year.
Yes, and I'll speak to the regulatory front for a moment and then also ask Ariel to chime in. As some of you will know, and Jim just referenced it, the USDOT issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on November 23rd with the comment period ending on Christmas Eve on codifying a department-wide rule for implementation of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is the major environmental law that talks about how to prepare environmental impact statements, environmental assessments for all federal actions. This notice is really noteworthy because there had been an internal departmental guide or order trying to harmonize NEPA procedures across the modal administrations. But what this notice does is codify that internal guidance into regulation. And what it does, and I think this could be the very first agency out of the entire federal government to do this, it attempts to codify the new Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ NEPA regulations that were just finalized on December 14th. So this was a very swift regulatory action, a very short comment period, and is sure to be a great deal of attention and concern, especially if the agency attempts to finalize those rules between the end of the comment period at Christmas and before the end of the administration. The other major regulatory area that's going to get a tremendous amount of attention deals with air standards, fuel efficiency standards, CAFE standards. There's already been movement, I should say, not from a regulatory standpoint, but from a policy standpoint. Some of the major automobile manufacturers have expressed a willingness to come back to the table to deal with US DOT, US EPA on those issues. And of course, you know, the current administration had been hostile to those types of deals and arrangements. So that's going to be a major source of action right away because not only does it deal with transportation policy, but it marries right into a major environmental priority for the Biden administration as well. Ariel, are there major regulatory provisions in terms of automation or related issues that you think might get attention early on in the administration?
Yeah, there are a number, and you know, I'll walk through those as we move along. But I did want to just mention one interesting follow-up, Fred, to what you noted about the NEPA piece. I'd, of course, defer to you and on the substance of it. But you know, I think one interesting observation might be with efforts like this, kind of the typical end of administration push on items. But there's also you know, something that might get lost in all of the focus on substance and policy as things turn over is the process reforms that this DOT undertook, which is to require the publication. I think they call it the rule on rules and the guidance on guidance to put items out even where it's not required, or to provide for comment on internal documents that might can be codified in other ways, or guidance that's issued needs to be put out for public comment first. And I wonder, you know, how that plays out. I've already seen it in one instance that we'll talk about with on the automation side, the reinterpretation of the Google letter. but that's something to keep in mind as there's an effort to, like in the end of any administration, to push to get things out, following those rules and guidance on how to do so, on the process that they put in place, is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons there's a great deal of attention on the OMB nominee. I know it's a little bit off topic, but as folks know on the call, the role and the impact of the Office of Management Budget on all things regulations across the federal government is huge. And the way that office is run, its priorities, how it allows agencies leeway or not in its regulatory actions is a huge source of attention and concern. So that's another thing to look out for. Okay, I'll move to the next piece. Ariel, why don't you take us through some of potential issues and priorities in the technology and innovation area.
Great. So maybe organizing in a couple ways. First is to talk through some of the dimensions, the emerging issues or the existing issues on automation and technology and innovation, and then sort of talk through what looks, as I think of it, sort of issues that are have continuity, and then issues where there's going to be or expected to be a new beginning. So as we look at this particular landscape, it's the issue that can get a lot of the attention is, of course, autonomous vehicles. But unpacking that, you also have issues related to just the sensors themselves, LiDAR, camera, et cetera, and radar, that do have a strong nexus with how standards that are set at the department at NHTSA. And then as you work out from that, you have intelligent transportation systems, infrastructure, of course, where some of those sensors get built into fixed infrastructure. And then looking at the spectrum issues that some may be familiar with, had a recent development at the FCC. But even beyond AVs, there, of course, and there are cross-cutting issues such as spectrum, but UAS and drones is going to be something that will be top of mind on the technology agenda for this DOT. And then as you go beyond that, of course, there are things like the department had established the NET Council, the Non-Traditional Emerging Transportation Technology Council, to look at so-called cross-modal technologies such as Hyperloop. And then so the question is, how much of that, or does all of it have a place in this administration in terms of developing policies? And then looking at what does it mean for a priority to be electrification? How does that ripple through or slice through all of these different technology dimensions, so to speak, right? So if Hyperloop does have a promising future, is it more favored because of its impact on climate issues or lack thereof, and does that supersede other types of things? And so those are the questions that we need to be asking. Now, on the particular regulatory developments, going to the issues of bifurcation of continuity versus a new beginning, I think it's probably worth starting with autonomous vehicles, and I think there the picture is mixed. There has been discussion and a perception that this administration, their approach on autonomous vehicles has been to look at the industry and try to let the industry continue to develop and innovate, and then take guidance, in a sense, take cues from the industry on how to then progress, not to get ahead of those developments. And I think that's really the guiding principle of the current DOT. Now, it's been signaled, I think, that the incoming administration would take a closer look and maybe put more emphasis on being proactive in developing safety standards for the industry. And I think the $64,000 question really is, what does that look like? If that was an easy question to answer, it's likely the case that the current administration, the current DOT, would have started down that path. What we've seen, and I think when we think about whether it's continuity versus a new beginning, the place to look is the advance notice of proposed rulemaking that was put out. Actually, it's going to be published officially tomorrow and start the clock. What happens to that? That's soliciting comment on a safety framework for automated driving systems. And that comment period, I think, I would have to check my calendar, but likely closes. I think it will close after inauguration. Does the new DOT and the new administration use that as the basis and run with that, or is it going to be starting from scratch? And I think the competing impulses there are, of course, taking a different approach philosophically, but also starting from scratch will then further delay the development of safety standards for the autonomous vehicle industry. So I think those are just some competing impulses on that front. And then one other note here, I would say, or maybe a couple of other notes, just on the unmanned aircraft systems, the drones. There are a couple of rules that are about to be finalized at pending OMB review. That's operations over people and remote identification. It's expected that those will get finalized before inauguration. I think that's a good example where there's likely to be a good amount of continuity between the two administrations. Maybe not certainly not on the specifics of the details, but just the overall understanding that this industry is growing. There's a consensus that there's a certain number of things, basic building blocks, regulatory building blocks that need to be put into place in order to allow the industry to develop and innovate and thrive. And layering into that, I think the very direct issues, competition with China and DJI and those types of things, I think make it so that it's less prone to some of the push and pull that you see in autonomous vehicles. Not to mention the fact that those rules getting finalized will really open up the opportunity for the incoming administration and DOT to build upon that because they've already been issued. So that's, a good example there. And then we could pause there. I mean, I could talk a little bit later about the modal priorities, maybe talk through some of that. But I'll mention one other thing. Yeah. I'll just say one last thing, and that is the one area to look at as we, on the innovation and technology side, is just going to be on the data and cybersecurity front. So just one note there. There's been some work, some documents, some guidance put out on particularly cybersecurity, but it's not something that has gotten really fully developed in the past 4 years. And whether it's privacy issues or just data collection issues or cybersecurity, I would expect that there will be more attention devoted to that, and there'll be, we'll certainly be learning more and hearing more about those issues in the near future.
Thanks, Ariel. Before I let you go and switch topics, do you see any overlap between some of the items that you have raised here and that may be pushed forward during the administration, and the whole issue of funding for surface transportation and the potential advance of a vehicle mile traveled pilot program or transition to that type of funding mechanism for surface transportation? Because it seems to me and to a lot of folks that the technology component of that plus the funding component of that sort of marry together quite well. Do you see any opportunities or attention to that space?
I think it's make sure I'm not on mute. Yeah, I mean, certainly when talking about funding and infrastructure on the sort of the user pay model, I think there could be a breakthrough. The fact that Chairman DeFazio remains chair of the T&I committee, I think that does help. And there's some things to solve for. Certainly, they're a very vocal group that looks at that from a privacy perspective, but at the same time, it also helps deal with on the EV front, recovering some of those costs for the use. So I think you're right to ask the question. I just mentioned on the funding side, On the technology piece, typically, I think what we should be looking for is a reversion to go all the way up until really January 19th, 2017. But this notion of grants and discretionary grants and other types of ways to incentivize or to focus on technology innovation and promoting that through departmental grants. January 19th, 2017 was when the previous administration, the one before this one, designated the AV proving grounds, and sort of measures like that, which there are so many, at this point, so many different discretionary grants through the department that have a nexus with technology. I think looking at those types of ways to get involved in the technology space, that's something that I think will come up in the infrastructure stimulus, and we should note the FAST Act REACT discussions that will be raging at the beginning of the administration.
Great, thanks so much. All right, I'll be covering the next topic, which is broadly capturing the civil rights and equity. And I think it's fair to say that just about all transportation policies and decision-making in a new administration are going to be touched by considerations of civil rights and equity. This has been a major point of emphasis during the campaign, and certainly a major point of emphasis with the individuals who are part of the transition team for the new administration. And while in some instances these issues seem to be pretty straightforward, and it's understandable how they relate, in some instances people have to understand how these kinds of issues are going to absolutely influence decision-making in a way that may not have been present certainly for the last 4 years, and candidly, even in years before that, where civil rights was certainly a greater point of emphasis in Democratic administrations. I think it's going to be an extremely high priority in this new administration. So I've suggested just a few issues, but there's more than really just these three. So, for example, planning and development. The question of what transportation projects get advanced, what projects get funded, and where the priorities are for advancing certain projects depends in large part on the metropolitan planning system and processes all around the country. If a project doesn't get into a state's transportation plan, the TIP and the STIP, as they're called, they oftentimes don't get forwarded at all. They don't get advanced at all. In other instances, there's been an historic clash between major metropolitan areas and state DOTs and state capitals in major jurisdictions around the country. And again, there has been a tendency to promote highway solutions instead of other sorts of solutions in the transportation world. And I believe there's a definite sense that that trend, that tendency, has worked to the detriment of underserved and disadvantaged communities. From a transportation standpoint, what does that mean? It means planning for greater transit opportunities, planning for micro-mobility to give opportunities for folks that don't have vehicles or maybe don't even have easy access to a train station or bus stations to try to get around more easily. And certainly other sorts of infrastructure issues. As Jim pointed out, the definition of infrastructure is much broader than just transportation, but as it relates to broadband. And so there very well could be situations where state DOTs provide or are instructed to provide greater access to rights-of-way for the installation of broadband facilities to the extent that those projects need advancing in different localities in different states. All of those issues have a flavor of advancing the transportation opportunities, the reliability and safe transportation opportunities for communities that may not have received as much attention in the past. And the second bullet that I put up really captures what this means, is mobility is a right. mobility is a right. For folks that can't afford cars or don't have easy access to vehicles, but still need to get to jobs, still need to get to places where they're advancing themselves through education, still need to get medical treatment, how can we best get people there? And what are the variety and spectrum of type of projects and type of things to get folks to all those places that don't necessarily, have cars? And so I think you're going to see, through funding mechanisms, as Ariel suggested again, the whole discretionary grant programs and those that may be put into a new transportation bill will absolutely have an emphasis on these types of issues. So not just transit per se, but transit that helps and helps promote the welfare of disadvantaged communities. Not just availability to ridership on demand, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, but ridership on demand for specific communities that may not have access to it, or trying to figure out ways that folks can, who may not have cell phones, can get access to those types of services that they may not have had in the past. And so as you can see, as I'm raising some of these, different considerations, how civil rights can really work its way into the discussion from the very outset, from planning to funding to technology, and it's going to be a major thrust of a new DOT, no matter who is in charge. It's for sure going to happen. And then the sort of more traditional aspects of civil rights and equity in transportation have been categorized as in the environmental justice area and in Title VI. And for environmental justice, that's been around since the Clinton administration as a means for federal decision-making to take into account potential adverse effects to communities, poorer communities, disadvantaged communities. Again, the enforcement of that, the consideration of those sorts of issues for the last 4 years has not been a high priority. I don't think that's a political statement. I think it's just a factual statement. And it's going to be a very high priority now. And that has broad implications. So think for a moment to tolling facilities and toll roads. The environmental justice movement looks at those types of projects with great skepticism. Will everybody be able to afford a safer, smoother ride without traffic in and around town if this is the sort of the emphasis of the future? How do you address those kind of equity concerns, even for funding for those types of facilities and the use and the promotion of tolling for existing facilities, for example? And then in the Title VI area, it's safe to say that advocacy groups around the country are going to look to existing statutory authority to advance equity issues in transportation, perhaps in a way that's not been seen before. Title VI really has been underutilized in some ways as an enforcement mechanism when we think about funding decisions, when we think about citing decisions about where transportation facilities go. And I think it's a fair bet that groups like the NAACP, the ACLU, may be looking for ways to say, hey, if you're going to be spending X amount of $1 trillion in infrastructure in the future, Congress, if you can get yourselves together to agree to something like that, we don't want to see certain communities left out. And Title VI is a way to enforce some of that. And so I do believe that the existing environmental justice procedures, as well as an advancement of Title VI claims and issues, are going to be seen with much greater frequency in a new administration, if not necessarily by the administration itself, but by stakeholder groups who want to advance these concerns. And the last point I'll raise before I turn it over to the next slide on modal priorities is that you can't understate the importance of climate and climate issues as also a civil rights issue. Many of the advocacy groups supporting this administration really tie these two together. Where do some of these communities live? how does climate affect those communities, and in many instances, those two issues merge. So again, just as Jim had suggested, that climate issues are going to work their way into just about every policy issue, keep in mind that climate also has a relationship to civil rights issues, and I think people are going to be looking at that very closely. All right, I'll move on to our next slide, which is a summary of modal priorities. As you all know, 10 modal administrations inside the U.S. DOT. And while we can't cover all of them in detail for the remaining 20 minutes we have, we think we can at least hit the highlights for the main ones. So first, I'll turn it over to Jim to talk about aviation issues and the FAA. And Jim, you may be on mute.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks for pointing out I was on mute. Without any question, the dominant issue in terms of aviation safety that the new administration will face will be a continuation of the discussion, and I suspect perhaps further legislative action concerning how commercial aircraft types are initially approved by the FAA, and then how changes are incorporated over time. And as those of you who follow aviation know, and perhaps you don't follow aviation professionally, but you follow it just out of personal interest, the issue came up because of the two 737 MAX crashes and the fact that the system used to approve changes in different 737 models over the last 50 years was one of amending the existing basic approval certification. And so the debate, I think, will be robust about whether that should continue or be changed or replaced entirely in some instances. And that will be a debate that will spill over certainly in the Congress. One point, of course, is that uniquely at DOT, the FAA administrator is appointed for a fixed term of 5 years. So the current administrator, Steve Dixon, who was only appointed last year, still has ample time left on his fixed term. As President Trump has demonstrated, and as the courts have held, the president, even when there's someone in a fixed term position, nonetheless under the Constitution has the authority to remove that appointee before the term expires. Think Jim Comey. But I think the general view on a bipartisan basis is that Mr. Dixon has done a stellar job, and his resume was sort of the perfect resume for FAA administrators. So I don't expect to see a change there. But I do expect that he will be working closely with the new secretary on the issues I just touched upon briefly. Ariel's already mentioned the work that's going on with respect to drones, and that's an evolutionary process. I don't have a sense of whether a Biden administration is going to try to accelerate that process, but certainly the issues there are well defined, and there are people of good intentions and often well-funded positions who are on different sides of some of those issues. I mean, privacy is a for instance. So I think we'll see continuing activity there. And then the other area that is evolving pretty rapidly is commercial space licensing. And that involves licensing to particular launches as well as licensing commercial spaceports. And I don't have any reason to think that a Biden administration is going to make radical changes in that process. To the contrary, I think they're likely to view it as the Trump administration has viewed it, as an area of U.S. Innovation that's cutting edge and also strengthening the economy. And again, it's not just the rocket launches themselves, but it's expanding the infrastructure for such launches to new areas around the country.
Thanks, Jim. Before I move on, I wanted to give the CLE code to all attendees who need such a thing. And the code is Transportation 2020. One word, Transportation 2020. So there you go. 1 hour CLE is always a good thing. All right, I'll talk briefly about transit and rail. Jim correctly mentioned that the highest priority in the transportation world likely is going to be assistance for the transit community to try to get it back up on its feet in a post-COVID world. Unfortunately, we know that a post-COVID world is not imminent. Even with vaccines, it's going to take a solid year or more. Just yesterday, the Washington Post reported that WMATA announced, its budget with major service cuts and major reductions in staffing moving forward on the assumption that it's going to take that long to recover. And so I think there's no doubt that transit relief, transit safety, cleanliness, etc., is going to be a high priority in the transit world. There's absolutely no question. The other thing that I kind of believe is that the transit with a little t is going to be huge in a new administration. That is, things that can be done and built more quickly as opposed to major projects. So again, for those in the DC area, you think of the Silver Line, you think of the Purple Line. They have 8 to 10 year horizons to get up and running. I think this administration is going to be focused on things like bus rapid transit, things that could be built and put into place much more quickly that could provide service, create jobs, etc. On the rail front, all the action is going to be on high-speed rail. A priority in the Obama administration. Things have really got off the ground quite slowly. It was a very political program then, with state governors saying they didn't want to support high-speed rail grant funding. But now here we are again. Of course, in the first instance, the question the Trump administration asked for refunding money from California for certain high-speed rail projects that have been put on hold. That likely will be reversed. So the question is how quickly and how hard the administration will promote high-speed rail to try to diversify the mix of transportation in the country. On the highway front, one thing that I think all our panelists will agree is that the most apolitical statement is that safety is always the #1 priority of any DOT of any party. And that will continue. That will continue as a priority for the Federal Highway Administration, technology-wise, truck driver safety issues, etc. Safety will always be priority #1. But I think the era of building and siting huge new highway projects around the country will definitely be closed in the short term. There will be an emphasis on fixing it first. There will be an emphasis on maintenance of the existing facilities, but then always elevating safety concerns to issue #1, and that's never a bad thing. I mean, the public depends on a reliable, safe transportation system, and I would hope, as I think Jim could attest as a former secretary, that safety will always be issue #1. Ariel, do you want to speak about motor vehicle issues and other related modal issues?
Sure. Let me touch briefly on that. The first thing, and I'll re-invite Fred to comment on it also, is, of course, the elephant in the room. Out of the gate, when it comes to motor vehicles, the big priority for NHTSA, for DOT, is going to be to reverse, swing the pendulum back, whatever you want to say, on the fuel economy rulemaking that was put in place. And there's a number of different facets of that, including waivers and all of those pieces that I defer to Fred and your thoughts on. But I do want to make the point that when it comes to just sheer bandwidth of resources and time and effort on the part of the administration, DOT, and NHTSA in particular, that will have outsized priority, and it'll affect other issues. To what extent, it's impossible to say, but that's the first thing that needs to be mentioned. Beyond that, when it comes to motor vehicles, a focus. Of course, the current secretary, the current DOT, safety is #1 priority. It is for every administration. I think when looking at the specifics, there will be an examination of advanced driver assist systems, ADAS technology. This is there's a broader development going on with ADAS technology and autonomous, sort of fully autonomous technology. Wouldn't say meeting in the middle, but there's bringing them both into conversation together, where that may not have been the case a couple of years ago. But the incoming DOT will look at ADAS technology, and the current one as well has set in motion a couple of pieces on that, a couple of regulatory requests for comment and things like that. The NCAP update is going to be something, the new car assessment program, that was put out, a request for comment on focusing on ADAS, but there will be an even greater focus on that and the safety, and that will be wedded up with an effort in Congress as well, with Representative and Subcommittee Chair Schakowsky and Pallone on Energy and Commerce, Chairman Pallone. So looking at ADAS and safety, I think that will be a big modal priority for NHTSA, and that'll, I think, carry over to, in some respects, to FMCSA, the motor carrier context. So I think that will be, and then the one last thing I'll mention, because there's a lot to mention, but I'll just note that one question mark will be what happens with the 5.9 spectrum, the connectivity, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to everything technology, and that very bizarre dynamic. Some may recall that the vehicle to vehicle mandate was almost crossed the finish line in 2016. Didn't quite get there. It was put on ice by this administration, and then subsequently, even just a couple weeks ago, the FCC repurposed more than half of the spectrum for Wi-Fi, which, to the great chagrin of DOT and others. Will there be an effort to reverse that, to do something along those lines? It probably, could require legislation. It could require FCC. Well, it would require FCC action. That's something to look at too in terms of priorities, to reclaim that spectrum and try and allow that industry to continue to develop, particularly the dedicated short-range communications DSRC technology that was really put aside. So those are a couple of high-level thoughts, but I don't know, Fred, if you wanted to provide comment on the fuel economy piece as well.
No, I think we've covered it pretty well, and in light of the time, I'd like to, open up to the question portion of the program. We already had an excellent one submitted that I'll raise for the group, and then invite others on the line to submit others as we go forward. The question was raised: what impact, if any, does the individual who would be named Secretary of the Department of Transportation have on any or all of these issues that we've discussed today? In other words, how much does that individual drive this agenda? How much do you think the White House would drive the agenda, regardless of who's appointed as Secretary? And with that, I think I should defer to the former Secretary to answer that first.
I will take a stab at it, Fred. Thanks. When I was at the Department of Transportation, I was there actually as General Counsel, then Deputy Secretary, and Secretary. I used to remind other political appointees and occasionally career appointees that only one person in an administration gets elected, although the Vice President also gets elected, but the Vice President, as we know, is, in this day and age, selected by the President. So in terms of managing a department like DOT, if you have a secretary who understands that and who tries to apply the principles and the policies that the President ran upon and was elected upon, then you're likely to find that the department is over time better aligned with what that President wants it doing. But the department itself is so vast and complex, and of course it's only one of many federal agencies, that making decisions day in and day out on significant policy issues, which is what a secretary is supposed to do, means that that person has a lot of discretion. And so even when you're exercising that discretion in good faith, trying to adhere to the policies that got your president to the White House, you still have to make lots of decisions where the president does not have a position or has not had an opportunity to really think about the issue. And that means that it does matter. And the person in that job can come from any of a myriad of backgrounds, as we have seen in the modern era. The department was created in '67, so its whole history is arguably in the modern era. And so people still matter. And having someone who, for example, comes out of an urban environment will make a difference at the margin on a lot of issues and how they're called at the secretarial level, or someone that has been a governor, or someone that might have served in Congress for some period of time, or comes out of the private sector. And then your own background influences what you're interested in, what areas you want to focus on and emphasize in terms of policy priorities and initiatives. So it's a good question, and we'll see how President-elect Biden decides to answer that question. But it does make a big difference over time.
Yeah, Jim, it's Fred. I'll add that your observations really manifest themselves in my own personal experience. The manner in which an Anthony Fox ran the agency, given his perspective as a mayor of a medium to large city, the issues that he felt were most important from a transportation and mobility perspective were quite different from Secretary LaHood and the sorts of issues that Secretary LaHood wanted to advance. The one thing I remember Secretary LaHood telling me, and I'll never forget this, when he left the agency, he said, I can't thank you all enough for making this a successful tenure, and the reason that he gave for making it most successful wasn't so much all the individual policy initiatives, and he was very proud of them, but he said, you don't realize how happy the president has been with us that we have not been the subject of trouble. He said, we haven't caused any bad headlines, we haven't been in the news, and it's allowed him to focus on other sorts of really very complicated and major issues. And so I remember that as clear as day, and that I think it's a message for good leadership at the department. It's an area where there is a lot of consensus. There's a lot of agreement. People like having these facilities be built. They like safe facilities. They like reliable facilities. They love how technology can make their lives better. And so there should be a lot of consensus. And in a lot of ways, if a secretary can advance those things calmly and carefully, using the Ray LaHood principle, it'll be a very successful tenure, no matter who is appointed. Ariel, anything else you'd add on that before we move on?
No, I think you captured it. I have some recollections about all that, but I think you fairly captured it.
Great. It's 1 minute after the hour, and we started about 2 minutes after the hour on the front side. Just one last question for the group, and then we'll kind of move on. Do you believe it will still be true, even with COVID and with the economy being such important issues, that the infrastructure issue, transportation infrastructure in general, will still be a high priority for a new administration? In other words, the last administration started a little bit on health care, even though the Trump administration had talked a lot about infrastructure, and then it ended up being, got caught up in a lot of other issues politically and otherwise. Even with COVID and the economy, do the two of you believe that transportation infrastructure can still rise to the top of issues that the administration will address? Ariel, why don't you start?
That's a tough one. I mean, as we've seen, everything can change on a dime. It'll be at the top. I mean, we can make all the jokes about infrastructure week and all that lasted however many months in previous go around. But I think the economic recovery is going to be so important in combination with the vaccine, and I think infrastructure naturally is part of it in combination with the stimulus. So I think it's hard to see a scenario where it's not front and center. But I just go back also to the question. I think a big part of that depends on the outcome in the Senate. And it's more likely that infrastructure, that will be elevated if Republicans retain control of the Senate. If not, then the impulses to make, to advance legislation in areas like healthcare and immigration and climate will be, I think, could ultimately push infrastructure down the list.
Jim, I'll give you the last word.
And the last word is the great question that hangs over infrastructure legislation, as we traditionally think of it, highway and transit programs in particular, is how do you pay for it? And we have kicked that can down the road again and again. And so whether the new Congress and a new administration will be willing to really come to grips with that, and then the further question of not only how much you're going to raise in revenues, we go into the Highway Trust Fund for highway and transit programs, but the further question of whether we are now going to get seriously focused on moving to more of a user pays model, a vehicle miles travel model in particular, as there is going to be such an emphasis on moving away from petroleum-based trucks and automobiles. So the pay-for issue could crater serious movement yet again. We'll just have to see.
All right, thank you. Again, for all our attendees, your CLE code is Transportation 2020. One word, Transportation 2020. On behalf of everybody at Venable and the folks from the various practice groups who contributed to these webinars, our legislative group, our transportation group, our environment group, thank you so much for taking time to be with us. Check back on our website for a recording of this session and other sessions and topics. And I wish you all a very safe holiday season and best wishes for a healthy 2021. Thank you very much.